τρίτη και μετά όπου θέλει. Σειρά και μετά. Ναι, παρακαλώ.
Καλό σας απόγευμα. Good evening. It's really a great pleasure to introduce the most prominent scholar of international relations today. It's a great privilege to have with us Professor Kenneth Waltz. Professor Waltz is 86-year-old and recently has stopped making public appearances. So it's really an honor for us, for our university, to be here. He came to Greece for a good reason. This coming Friday, he will receive an honorary PhD from the University of Macedonia in Thessaloniki. And we used this opportunity to have him here with us, essentially to honor him and to honor his work. Let me start with some references about his academic work, and then I will move to explain his contributions in the theory of international relations. Kenneth Waltz was born in 1924. He got his BA in economics from Oberlin College and his PhD from Columbia University in 1954. Actually, his PhD dissertation, 5 years later, turned to a very prominent book, The Man and State at War, that has been recently translated in Greek. He spent most of 25 years of his teaching career at the University of California, Berkeley. But after graduating from Columbia, he started teaching at Columbia, then at Sophomore College, then to Brandeis, and then he moved in the early 70s to Berkeley. And he stayed there for 27 years, and recently he moved back to Columbia. So apparently he likes New York. Professor Waltz has been elected president of the American Political Science Association in 1987 to 88, which is something very rarely given to a person in international relations. American Political Science Association is dominated by American politics and comparativism, so it's very rare to have an IR theorist in that position. He's also a fellow on the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has written several books, The most important is his dissertation, The Man-Stated War, and then his monumental theory of international politics in 79. He has written several other books on nuclear weapons, collection of articles, a standard textbook on the use of force with Professor Art. So he has written immensely, but most important is his contribution. So what I will now do is to try to place Professor Waltz in the history of ideas. Okay, as you know, realism is the most important school in international relations. And within the realist school, the most important school is neorealism. It is the school that started in 79 with the work of Professor Waltz. Let me now talk about realism and try to see its development and how we can locate Professor Waltz in the history and the evolution of realism. Okay, realism, believe it or not, started here in Piraeus. The most important father of realism is Thucydides, which was born a couple of blocks from Piraeus in Alemos. But essentially, what Thucydides expressed were some ideas that were before him. The ideas that people like Thrasymachos and Protagoras and Gorgias expressed, the so-called sophists. These sophists were wise men teaching actually politics. The most important piece of realism actually took place in a symposium here in Athens. In this symposium, the realist ideas were contrasted with idealistic Platonian ideas and were immortalized by Plato in his famous Politeia. So, this famous symposium, that is really the genesis of realism, as I told you, took place in Piraeus. Piraeus was important because it was the place for the navy, it was the instrument of the Athenian empires, the navy, a trading center, and the long walls. The fourth instrument were allies, but three of the four instruments of the Athenian empire were here in Piraeus. So Piraeus was an important place for gathering. And on an occasion of a religious holidays, Thracian warriors performed on horseback with fires. These important events brought the Athenian youth in Piraeus and with the Athenian during Socrates. So they gathered here in Piraeus in the house of Polemarchus to discuss justice. And from this discussion, realism started. If you read carefully Politeia, the basic thesis that Plato tried to refute was the thesis given by Thrasymachos, a sophist, which means a man of Sophia and teacher of wisdom. He actually claimed that justice is nothing more than the advantage of the stronger, period. The whole Politeia was an effort by Plato to refute this statement. So here we have the genesis of realism and idealism. In this statement, Thrasymachos made four important points very relevant to realism. First, that justice is not universal, ecumenical, but it's man-made. As another sophist, Protagoras, said, man is the measure of all things. The second is that the code of justice is self-interest. The third statement is that power determines the version of justice to prevail. And the fourth statement is that the driving force behind human nature is self-interest, which implies a pessimist picture of human nature. So in these four elements, pessimist view of human nature, power, interest, and lack of existence of universal standards of morality and justice is what it really was the core of the realist assumptions. Now, as I tell Plato and Socrates did not agree with it, and Plato wrote his famous Politeia in order to refute these arguments. As you can understand, Plato dominated in philosophy, and Thrasymachos dominated international relations. Now, Thucydides, who, as I said, was born next to Piraeus, tried to apply these ideas in the Peloponnesian War. So essentially, Thucydides, not being a philosopher, essentially used this ammunition that I just said that came out of the sophists. By the way, sophists got a bad name as twisting the truth because of Plato. Literally, it meant men of wisdom. But Plato gave them that name of making the strong argument weak, namely the realist argument is weak, and they are twisting the truth. So historically, at least in philosophy, sophists mean something bad. Okay, Thucydides was really took the sophist canon and applied it in the Peloponnesian War. But he did a contribution. He extended the concept of power from the level of the men to the level of the international system. And he showed how the distribution of power was the cause of war. According to Thucydides, the basic cause of the Peloponnesian War was that the Lacedaemonians, the Spartans, afraid the Athenian power, and they decided to stop it by war. So we had an explanation of war that looked at the distribution of power at the international level. So on Thucydides, there is the birth of realism in international relations. Now, there are two elements in Thucydides' work. One, placing emphasis on self-interest, power, and human nature. This I call traditional or classical realism. This realism, through the centuries, developed through Machiavelli to modern days, and in America was popularized by your friend Morgenthau, the father of classical or traditional realism. Of course, Machiavelli made some revolution there that says, you know, power and interest have to do with the states, with state interest, which look for survival. So you could see all the path from Thucydides to traditional realism. There is a second path, however, on realism that starts from the other idea of Thucydides, how power is distributed in the international system, and the distribution of power can determine the causes of war and peace. This idea was taken from Hobbes, Rousseau, and recently this insight was used by Kenneth Waltz to establish the neo-realist school, that the distribution of power at the international system is the important cause of war and peace. By making this analysis in 1979, Professor Waltz revolutionized realism. You see, for Waltz did not need anymore the assumptions of human nature, the pessimist need of human nature to explain war. Men can be either good or bad, it's irrelevant. What it matters, it was the distribution of power in the international system. And his explanation was outside in, from the international system, trying to explain, and he reversed the traditional inside-out explanation for men and states trying to explain war. So that's a second revolution. Another important revolution was that he did traditional realists, and of course Morgenthau placed a lot of emphasis on power. Power not only an instrument, but an end in itself. States to survive need expansion, need power, hungry for power. Professor Waltz said no. The most important thing is survival, and you just need power to survive. Power is not an objective, power is a means. And actually it's stupid to have too much power, because then there are counter coalitions against you. You have, on the other hand, you should be very weak. You should have little power, you should have a lot of power. You have the just amount of power. Because what is the just amount? What is needed for survival? That's it. And the other interesting contribution to realism is that realism from Thucydides, Machiavelli, is really, and Morgenthau, is inductive. You take some historical events, you analyze it, and you generalize. Professor Waltz did the opposite. Actually, Hobbes, what has tried to do the opposite using a cleaner democracy, but Professor Waltz, using philosophy of science, reversed the model, and he derived the whole analysis from anarchy, from anomy, from anarchy in the international system. So, according to Professor Waltz, the most important thing is lack of hierarchy in the international system, it's anarchy. This anarchy creates competition. In this competitive system, for states to survive, they have to do it by themselves mostly. That's the principle of self-help. But things that states do for their security, for their survival, create insecurity for the other. That's the typical security dilemma. And insecurity breeds competition and war. When we analyze the system, we have to look at the distribution of power and, most importantly, what are the main actors. And the main actors in the international system are states. So it's a state-centric system. States need to survive. In order to survive, they have to be rational. He doesn't assume that states are rational, but the system creates an incentive for rationality. If you are not rational, if you don't play your cards correctly, you will lose. And if you lose at the level of war, you may disappear. So, Professor Waltz does not accept the assumption of rationality. He only says that there are systemic imperatives to be as rational as possible. So that's the rationality assumption. And of course, the number one objective of the state is survival. Survival means two things. Territorial survival and political survival, independence. Professor Ephesus loves the whole thing on independence, writing on independence all the time. But independence has another component, territorial survival as well. Self-determination and territorial survival. So that's survival. Now, in order to survive, countries use power as a means and not as an end, and they are forced to balance others. And somehow, by trying to get their self-interest balancing, there is an invisible hand in the market, and in the long run create balancing. And that's the universal law of balance of power. In a few words, that's the analysis of Professor Waltz, that's his revolution in realist thinking. As you can understand, this type of analysis cannot come from normal political science. Professor Waltz actually became political science by accident. He wanted to study political philosophy. And somehow in Colombia they sidetracked him and they made him do a dissertation that was using political theory in international relations. So then he had fun with international relations and he forgot about political theory. So that's the only way that you could have the contribution at these philosophical levels, because essentially he continues the line of thought that started with sophists and Thucydides, and of course in his work he has attacked all kinds of idealism and utopianism. Of course, in modern politics, utopianism and idealism takes the form of liberalism and its ideas that law, democracies, and commerce which bring the eternal peace, the Kantian idea. For Professor Waltz, these things are not happening, and it's still power interest, but most importantly, the distribution of power. So that's my reading of Professor Waltz, and now what we have asked him to do is really to try to use his theoretical concepts in order to give us some insights about the current distribution of power in the international system and where the so-called world is going, in order to see how a theorist can apply theoretical insight to say something meaningful about current international politics. Again, it's a great honor, Professor Waltz, to help you here, and we are really excited and waiting to hear you. Thank you.
Thank you. very much. It's a wonderful introduction and a very thorough and accurate summary of what I tried to do. I must say I'm awfully pleased to be here where it all began. Everybody in international politics who considers himself a realist begins with Thucydides. We're all grounded in Thucydides. Without him, I don't think there would be any international study of international politics. So it's a great honor as well as a pleasure for me to be here. Let me say how I began to think in terms of structure. It is significant that I started in mathematics and economics. In economics, of course, they have a concept. It's the very heart of economics, the concept of a structure, and it's called by economists the market. And there are differentiations of the market, competitive systems, oligopolistic systems, monopolistic systems. And similarly in international politics, there are large numbers of systems. Traditionally, people who have studied international politics have thought in terms of 4 or more states, 3, which is considered to be, understandably, a very unstable system because 2 can always gang up against 1 and drive that 1 out of the system. So one then ends up with a bipolar system. And I made the argument in 1964 that the bipolar system is stable, which was flying in the face of tradition because it was almost the unanimous opinion of people studying international politics that you needed 4 or better yet 5. You need 4 so you can have 2 opposing coalitions. In other words, makes an alliance system possible. And then 5 so that there will be a balancer which will help to guard against the outbreak of war. Now, the notion that 5 was good and that a balancer was wanted and could possibly exist, of course, was simply a summary of the history of the time. There were 4 great powers, plus Great Britain, which stood somewhat outside of the system. Splendid isolation was the policy of Britain until roughly 1900. And Britain, because of its somewhat aloof position, was able to throw its weight on one side or the other and thus lessen the chances that war would break out. That was a kind of idealized version of the history of international politics up to about, well, up to the early 1900s. If you read old texts, if you read, say, Morton Kaplan, who's not read much anymore, he schematized all of this and put it into very scientific terms. But it actually, the scientific terms are simply a way of describing what we all took to be the usual international political system. The concept of structure was absent from international politics until I introduced it. And it left people making statements such as the well-known statements of Henry Kissinger that moderate states make international political systems moderate, or legitimate states make international political systems legitimate. And moderate and legitimate states in contrast to revolutionary states. If you have revolutionary states, the international system becomes a revolutionary system or an unstable system. It's exactly the kind of thinking that Durkheim ridiculed when he asked the question, when he asked such questions as these. Why did the Greeks produce all of that wonderful philosophy? And the answer is the Greeks were a very philosophic people. Why did the Germans produce all that marvelous music? The Germans were a very musical people, and so on. And if you follow that, it's the same thing as saying revolutionary states make international political systems unstable or revolutionary. The cause is found in the acting unit. And that is the pattern of traditional political science. It's the pattern of Hans Morgenthau. To take the one I think we all would agree was the greatest of the classical or traditional international politics people. Right? He's saying good states produce good outcomes. Bad states produce bad outcomes. You look at the acting unit and what that acting unit is like in order to infer what the whole international political system will be like. Now, there is no conception in traditional realism of a structure. There's nothing analogous to a marker. So all you need to know, all you can know, is the quality of the actors, and then you infer the outcomes of the quality of the actors. Introducing the term structure, that is, the notion that something is interposed between the acting unit and the outcomes the acting units produce, is the contribution of structural theory. And within structural theory, of course, it matters how many major units there are, unless we get to discussions and debates about the significance of 5 or 4 or 2, or something that few of us really thought of very much. 1. The international political system of 1 isn't really an international political system. It's a dominated system. So the question now becomes, after unipolarity, what? And I think everybody's answer, including mine, is after unipolarity, China. And then we will once again have a bipolar world. And after now, that's assuming that China remains a coherent, competent state, which, as I think, is practically a pretty good assumption. And then after China, we expect, in due course, India, and still longer time, maybe Brazil. So it looks as though the present unipolar system will last, say, 20 or 30 years, followed by a bipolar system, and due course, a multipolar system. So I think that's where we're heading, and we pretty well understand the implications of the differences of those numbers, except for one big thing, and that's nuclear weapons. And what I propose not to talk about, but may well come up in the discussion, is the way in which nuclear weapons transform international politics. And transform means, of course, to change radically, or to move from a system in which certain maxims apply to a system in which they no longer apply. They find themselves standing on their heads. They're negated. A whole different set of maxims come into being. And that, which I think is a subject for perhaps for another occasion, that in my view is where the world is headed.
The way that we have decided to proceed is to have asked Professor Waltz to make some introductions, and then we ask 6 professors of the University of Piraeus and Pantheon to utilize Professor Waltz's presence here to ask some questions in order to have a discussion to illuminate different aspects of his thinking, but also his analysis of modern affairs. That's why we call this a round-table discussion. In California, next to Berkeley, was Stanford, where Professor Papasopiriou studied. Actually studied with one of your colleagues, Alexander George. So let's have California talk first. So Professor Papahristou.
I'm very grateful that Professor Waltz is here. We met once before because he came to Stanford for a closed meeting. Professors and PhD students. We had already.
But it's like Olympiacos and Panathinaikos Stanford and I don't get along well.
No, but in IR we're doing well.
I know my co-author is. We get along very well.
Yeah, it's second of class.
We disagree.
Oh, you disagree.
Good friends.
Now, I wanted to say that obviously your structural realist approach is very elegant. Very few variables, explains a lot. And that's really the power of this approach. It's an elegant, simple theory that has a lot of explanatory and predictive power. But one thing that I always wondered is, it seems to me that your model is a static equilibrium approach. From bipolar to multipolar, but how do you account for change? How does change take place in the international system? Why do we go from bipolar to multipolar? What's the cause for changes in the distribution of power?
Should I answer these?
Yes,
yeah. Okay.
First, we agreed that I think we should take one by one.
Right, sure. Well, why did we move, for example, from multipolarity to bipolarity? Various countries who populated the multipolar world got into a war. And the outcome of the war, now the outcome of previous wars had not been this way. That is, previous wars always left enough great powers standing to permit or enable the reconstitution of the old system. And sometimes this was even done consciously. For example, at the conclusion of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, France was admitted back into the system in order to retain the multipolar system of balance. Right? Now, after World War II, so many countries had been defeated so badly that the multipolar world became a bipolar world. I mean, that is the process by which change occurs. That is, one can say rightly, as was just suggested, that a system is static, that is, the structure remains the same, usually for long periods. If we date the modern international political system from 1648, as is the custom, then we can say the multipolar world lasted for about 300 years. That's a long time. Right? But once the multipolar world ended, the international political system became less stable. That is, a consequential change occurred more frequently. And that's the bipolar world. Again, explaining the change, the bipolar world disappeared and was replaced by a unipolar world simply because one country could not keep up. I wrote a piece in 1985, and then again said the same sort of thing in the 1979 book. The question is, can the Soviet Union keep up? And in 1985, that was a rather bold statement because the consensus in international politics was that the United States was declining and the Soviet Union was rising. And in fact, the Chinese based their whole foreign policy on that assumption. That is, they tried to throw their weight onto the American side in order to keep the system stable. They completely misread what was happening in the two countries, as I tried to tell them when I gave lectures in China. And they didn't believe me at the time. They believe me now.
Professor Chaviris?
Professor Waltz, we actually presented a scheme of things where we moved essentially from a multipolar to a bipolar system to unipolarity right now, then bipolar again. Eventually, we moved. So there's a nice symmetry there. But I was struck by the fact that you said we will have unipolarity for another 20 or 30 years. And on the one hand, the unipolar moment with the great attack invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan was not necessarily a great success for international relations, as you very well predicted in your work and have been predicting for decades now. But my question is, given what has been happening in the past few years, with the United States having a lot of debt, the United States actually trying to get out of Iraq as much as possible and as soon as possible, with Obama leading from behind in Libya, with the United States trying to leave Afghanistan, perhaps after the death of bin Laden, a process that will be accelerated. Could it be the case that for the next 20 to 30 years, what we will have is unipolarity light, or not exactly what we had during the Bush years? Or could it actually, the process towards a bipolar system, be accelerated? Or do you still stick to the 20 to 30 year assessment?
Well, the 20 to 30 year assessment is, of course, a guess, and guesses can be wrong. I think everybody agrees that the United States is a country in relative decline, but I think probably almost everybody agrees that the world is still a unipolar world. Now, I don't think unipolar worlds are desirable, so I'll be glad to see it end. I probably won't live long enough, but I would be glad to see it end more rapidly than I think it will, but these things usually do take time. You know, the United States is it's not untypical. I mean, it's not only a great power, it's the greatest power, as the greatest power often does. It woefully, tremendously overspends on its military, which of course in the long run is a way to weaken the country, not to make it stronger. If you don't like unipolarity, you owe a great debt to George Bush because he hastened the end of the United States as the great power in the world. We may disagree on how much he hastened it, but I think we probably all agree that he did, you know, by cutting taxes and increasing spending. I mean, that's a sure recipe for driving the country not into, but toward bankruptcy. He did that magnificently. Dominant powers throughout history abuse their power. They overreach. They bite off more than they can chew. And there are a number of cliches we can use to depict that, and the United States has done just exactly what we expect dominant powers to do. Abuse the position that they're in. We've done it.
It's an interesting statement. Professor Waltz doesn't like unipolarity because it brings expansion into the realism. But that's kind of contradicts the image that we have for realists. The realists are usually the warmongers, the expansionists, the Machtpolitik, conservative guys. I mean, what we hear doesn't fit the way that they have framed realists. I mean, how you, for example, Morgan Howe, reacted to repeated American interventions? How a typical realist will stand, will comment on American interventions?
Oh yeah, yes. Morgenthau and I, and a relatively small number of others that during the war in Vietnam, most of you are way too young to remember how this unfolded. At the beginning of the war in Vietnam, there were two groups of people, the two groups of people who were most enthused about the war were the better educated people, my colleagues in the universities, right? And young people. Huh? And if you talk to young people now about this period of history, they'll say, well, it was the young people who led the forces against the war in Vietnam. And that is true right up until it looked as though those young people in colleges and universities would be drafted. And then they discovered it was the wrong war, fought in the wrong place, it was unjust, it was terrible, but until then, they were among the strongest supporters of the war. So we have to have a historical sense. Now, what do realists do? They don't sum up. They may advise, but what they do is describe and criticize. They describe what states do. They describe what mistakes states make, and they point out those mistakes and advise better policies. And that doesn't get people like me saying, no, Vietnam has no significance in the wider international politics. It did not make any difference. And incidentally, both Henry Kissinger and Brezhnev, the ruler of the Soviet Union, said this. They said this almost in so many words. It doesn't make any difference who wins or who loses in Vietnam, because winning or losing will not tilt the world balance. So who cares? The Vietnamese, they cared.
Professor Ipestos.
Good evening. Your description of the international system and its functions is precise, is verifiable, and is true. So far I read in my books. Still there is a determinant factor, determinant difference, I would say, in front of us, evolving. The colonial age and the Cold War age is over, and you have the comeback, if you may say so, of traditional nations, of the ancient nations, which are now big powers, and in the way to a multipolar world. I have the feeling that they drive for balancing would be more sharp and thus more conducive to stability. And at issue, what I'm saying, is not the regime which is obsolete, it's over. The regime debate is over. Simply some people at the university still debating. Is the kind of society, is the anthropology, the political anthropology which is attached to its existence, to its self-preservation, to its freedom also, will behave the same way that you say, but more sharply maybe in balancing.
What point would you like me to discuss?
Yeah, to debate, to discuss whether more sharp balancing, more sharp balancing, more sharper balancing, yeah, sharper balancing will make the hegemonic balancing more effective and be prompt to stability.
Yeah, there's one thing that I mentioned that hasn't been taken up, and that is it's a different world now because a number of countries have nuclear weapons. What does it mean to balance in a world in which major and not so major countries, North Korea can hardly be called a major country, have nuclear weapons? As de Gaulle, Charles de Gaulle was a much wiser man than at least Americans are willing to admit in matters of international politics. As de Gaulle always said, nuclear weapons don't add up. In other words, if you have nuclear weapons and I have nuclear weapons, and we combine our military strengths, we're right back where we started. Once countries have second strike forces, adding more weapons to what they already have, whether by their own internal efforts or whether by making an alliance with another nuclear country, makes no difference. Once you have a second strike capability, you have all the military capability that you can use. I mean, having more doesn't matter. That's one of the big differences between nuclear weapons and conventional weapons. With conventional weapons, you can never say how much is enough. With nuclear weapons, you can say very easily, I've got a second strike force, I don't care how many weapons you have. I have 1,000, you can have 10,000. It doesn't bother me. 1,000's enough, or in fact, 1,000's a lot more than enough to do any destroying that you might possibly want to do. And in fact, when 2 or more countries have nuclear weapons, nobody wants to use them. Just to contemplate using nuclear weapons in a world in which 2 or more countries have them is to contemplate devastation. The other country can do as much damage to you as it wants to, and you can do as much damage to it as you want to. So what's the point? Each country deters the other. And we know this is true. Now, for 65 or so years, we've had 2 or more nuclear countries. What have they done? Nothing. Nothing at the strategic level. It's possible to fight minor wars in peripheral places. It's not possible to fight big wars at the center of international politics. This is the great contribution of nuclear weapons, and it abolishes the possibility of balancing among the countries that possess them. A revolution in international politics. Unappreciated by most people.
Professor Koliopoulos, I'm sure, wants to add something about nuclear weapons.
Yeah, it has fallen upon me to add the N word, the nuclear weapons, but Professor... But of course, Professor touched upon this before me. Okay, so supposedly the nuclear weapons were the great equalizers, but actually they're not. We still have the power capability differences still matter. The United States is still a great power. North Korea is not a great power. You can see the difference. So nuclear weapons don't change the structure, but they do change something in the system. Do they change process? How will you define this? This is the first question. Second one, related to this. You have gone on record writing this magnificent piece, the spread of nuclear weapons. Professor Waltz was very careful. He preferred the word spread to the word proliferation. Spread meaning something more controlled, something slowly, if I have understood you correctly. And then actually he updated this piece, and the updated version was titled Toward Nuclear Peace. A very bold statement indeed. Okay. Overall, this seems to be verified by international practice. The great powers don't want other people to acquire, other states to acquire nuclear weapons. Some states have tried to acquire nuclear weapons, but we have the instances of some states that not only have refrained from acquiring, but some of them actually abandoned nuclear weapons that they had. Ukraine is a classical example. So, I would really like to hear your views on the structural, let's say, how could you invent a theoretical term, for instance, how does the systemic impact of nuclear weapons fit with the theory, what you still believe about nuclear peace, and how do you explain behavior like Ukraine? Thank you.
With Ukraine, it was really an economic transaction. It was costly for Ukraine to keep them. They were very well rewarded for giving them up. They did the sensible thing. They gave them up. Maybe it's a rare instance when a state makes a move as important as that one and makes the right move. But I think that Ukraine is fairly easy. Ukraine relinquishing its nuclear weapons is fairly easy to explain. What else are you going to say about it?
Systemic, how would you, let's say, feel the systemic implication with you, and what your opinions, what do you now think about nuclear peace?
Well, as I said, we've had 65 years of nuclear peace. You can say, if you look at history, that's a blink of an eye. What's 65 years when we're thinking about thousands of years of history? But as modern history goes, those. That's certainly a long period of peace. There's nothing to equal it. There's not anything that even approaches it. 65 years without war among the great and major powers. It used to be, in the pre-nuclear world, that if you asked the question, who fights the wars, the answer was the great powers. Right? When powers were great, they fought, and when they ceased to be great, they fought less or ceased to fight. Think of Sweden. Sweden was certainly one of the fiercest countries that Gustavus Adolphus and his successor. They fought all the way to Poltava in Russia. Right? Anything that got in the way, they fought. They ceased to be a great power, and now we think of Sweden, rightly, as being the very model of a moderate, well-behaved country. Now, once countries have nuclear weapons, being a great power doesn't mean that they fight wars. It means that they cannot fight wars. That's just one of the ways in which nuclear weapons stand the old truths about international politics on their head. They negate the old truths.
Professor Manitopoulos.
Thank you very much. Let me first thank my partners and colleagues here at the University of Piraeus for extending the invitation to me, and let me start on a personal note. I was a student in the United States many years ago, and I took a PhD seminar which was the most popular seminar at the time at the American University, which was called Masterworks in the International Relations. It was taught by Nicholas Oneff. And
The basic book.
and there was one session about Kenneth Waltz, and I remember the time that Nick Oneff invited John Gerard Draghi from Columbia to come and talk about theory of the IR, because he had written a seminar on influential article in world politics, sort of critiquing your work, and there was a big debate about the books. But then on, I met your son Daniel, who is a lawyer in Washington DC, and we became friends, and his wife, who is of Greek descent. But I've never had the opportunity and the honor to meet you, and I'm just honored to be at the presence here tonight in this panel. And let me make a few comments and ask a question. I do think that in the tradition of Isaiah Berlin and his talk about the hedgehog and the fox. And you're the hedgehog because I think your effort is to apply grand theory. You create a grand theory of IR. And you do that in the finest scientific tradition. And a tradition that betrays a deep understanding of social theory, philosophy, economics, and also betrays the interdisciplinary nature of IR. As we mentioned before, the structure is the market. And if I may add, the money is power. And so the structural theory of IR is one valiant effort to create the grand theory of IR. And I think one of the most successful in the finest tradition of the greatest scholars. Now, if we talk about the nature of the system and the future of the system today and the structure of the system, I single out three most important books that came out after the end of the Cold War. Each one of them ascribing to a different tradition, but nonetheless. And I want your take on those. One is by Fukuyama, The End of History, where he basically, running the risk of simplifying his thesis, I would say that he said that modernity and technology would create an environment in the international system whereby we would witness the expansion of liberal democracy in the political system and capitalism in the economic base. The second book was by Huntington, The Clash of Civilizations. And there he continued in the Hegelian dialectic, mentioning that there will be a new class, but this one will be between traditions, between the West and the rest. And the third one was by me assignment, the tragedy of great power politics. Now, almost 10, 11, 20 years following the end of the Cold War, we see that the two theses, Huntington's and Fukuyama's, are breaking at the seams, in the sense that the clash of civilizations is a very simplistic argument that now this monolith that is called Islam is breaking apart. Democracy, or some kind of transition democracy, has been institutionalized in the Arab world, and so on and so forth. Fukuyama, on the other hand, also has failed in most of his descriptions. The one argument that remains valid today is the argument of the great power politics. But there is my question. You mentioned before that the essence of realism is a state-centric system. But to what extent developments have eroded the sovereignty of the nation state today? To what extent can we claim that the nation state remains the most important unit of this international system, but to what extent other actors and other developments, globalization, economic forces, and so on, have eroded its importance?
Not much. I remember one seminar, a graduate seminar I was teaching at Columbia just a few years ago, and before the first session, as students were drifting in, one of them said to me, "Is it true that non-governmental organizations are more important than states?" No reaction? I mean, I thought that was the most peculiar question anybody has ever raised. I mean, are NGOs the creature of states? Or do they do what states don't want, or do they do what states do want? Where the hell do we think they get their money? They get their money from states, especially from the United States, maybe Western Europe, the European Union. I mean, they don't print money, they don't create money, they live off of states. Right? They are not independent actors. Mearsheimer is right. By and large, they serve the interests, they serve the purposes of the state. They are supported, sponsored, allowed to continue because they are found to be helpful to states. Aceh Vana, when that tidal wave swept over that little, well, not so little, a city, the tip of North Sumatra, 400 NGOs immediately descended on poor little Aceh Vana. What does that tell you? My wife and I looked at each other and we said, there must be a lot of money in disasters, because that opens the way for the NGOs to come in. Most NGOs are one, in fact I can say one man, one person. Most of them are one-man operations. That one man becomes very good. In fact, it's a lucrative career. If any of you students are looking for a lucrative career, that would be one. Right? You go to states that are interested in, that have money. You go to wealthy states, or wealthy people in wealthy states, and you sell the idea of a new NGO. I've known some of the people who run NGOs, and boy, they do nicely. So I recommend it, but I don't think it had much to do with international politics. Right? Source of income for individuals. I don't see any of the globalizing, You know, who does best in an increasingly interdependent world? The countries that are relatively independent. And most countries are independent. I mean, most countries are dependent on other countries that are independent. The largest and the wealthiest countries are relatively independent, and the poorer countries are very dependent. I remember one summer I was teaching, again at Columbia, and the topic for the next week was interdependence. So that nobody in the seminar knew at that time what position I took. And this French fellow came up to me and said, well, why are American political officials, why are academics and professors and journalists in the United States always writing about interdependence? We Frenchmen know we're not interdependent. We depend on you. You don't depend on us. Well, what the United States did, and I think in some cases knowingly, was to use interdependence as an ideology, disguising the fact that we were the independent, most other states were the dependent parties. And I guess some people bought it. I think probably most foreigners did not. Right? You can't compound dependence and independence and call it interdependence. So I'm not persuaded by the globalization. I mean, there's still, and it's a self-help system. Who's able to help himself best? The strongest and most prosperous.
I think out of your work on this point, it came the distinction between vulnerability, dependence, and sensitivity. I mean, of course you are interdependent, but this interdependence for one creates vulnerability, and for others means nothing. So that's a way of introducing the concept of power in a symmetrical relations. Okay, let me ask a provocative question, which actually I don't believe in, but I need to ask it. We have the state of nature, anarchy, competition. Hobbes described this question. He said, look, if people or states want to survive, they have to create a Leviathan. Somebody to give power, they lose some independence, but they get security. So Hobbes was very happy with the solution that he gave on Leviathan. A strong authority to bring peace. Now, the Leviathan doesn't necessarily need to be undemocratic. It can be a democratic world government if we take his assumption and we transfer it now into national politics. Why Hobbes' solution for a state is fine and not for the international system? Why not have a Leviathan? And why not have a democratic Leviathan to take us out of state of nature and bring peace?
Well, you know, organizations are created by their enemies. That's a social science cliche, which just seems to have a great deal of truth and validity. You organize against something. And if you were, there was a Frenchman named Moreau who wrote a book long ago, I think it was in the 30s, said that the title of the book was The Next War, the War Against the Moon. And of course the message was that the world is not going to unite unless it has something to unite against. Might have better said Mars is very difficult to form. You know, think of Adolf Hitler, or Hitler's Germany, and the very delayed, the very halting reaction to that. The obvious reaction by a realist political scientist would be to say, well, surely the Western powers and the Soviet Union should unite against Hitler. That alliance, you know, the alliance against Germany, or Germany, Japan, and Italy, as it later became, the alliance was not fully formed until well after the war began. The alliance was not, the war began in 1939, The alliance was not fully formed until the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, right? 2 years after the war began. And then there are a lot of historical, as Napoleon said, give me a coalition. Give me a coalition to fight. Right? Because what you can do if you're opposing a coalition is hope to try to split that coalition, pry it apart. Right? It's what I think Saddam Hussein thought he could do. I mean, after all, the coalition that formed against him, made up of Near Eastern countries, made up of Islamic countries, made up of authoritarian countries, made up of Western democracies. I mean, that looks like a coalition that you ought to be able to split apart. But of course, Saddam Hussein was so inept that he was not able to split even that coalition apart. But it tells you a lot. I mean, coalitions are hard to form and often easy to break up.
When you read the most important document of the United States, the National Security Strategy, the first page, first line, the most important threat is terrorism, or the possibility of coupling terrorism with nuclear weapons. We haven't heard a lot from your analysis about terrorism and the coupling of terrorism and nuclear weapons. And we have, in the unipolar world, the superpower says that's my biggest concern, that's my biggest threat.
Well, it depends on who's speaking for the superpower. If I were speaking for the superpower, I would say the threat of terror is immensely exaggerated. I mean, a terrorist cannot rend the fabric of society. They cannot occupy territory. They cannot do anything of lasting importance or significance. Rend the fabric of society. They cannot occupy territory. They cannot do anything of lasting importance or significance. They are bothersome, and incidentally, not very bothersome to the United States. They're much more bothersome to, say, Sri Lanka, which has a real terrorist problem, right? Or Pakistan and India. I mean, those are countries that have real worries. We don't, but you know, we're not used to being subjected to things like that, so we exaggerate their importance. A person who has consistently pointed this out is John Mueller, and I'm sure some of you know of his work. Now, you know, then along comes the possibility of nuclear terror. Well, in the first, in there, that's a real worry, but it is a limited worry. It was hardly any worry at all until Pakistan began to fall apart. And as I say, that is a real worry. No nuclear country is going to give nuclear weapons to any terrorist group. For one thing, I mean, there are very many reasons for that, but I'll just take what I think is decisive. The United States does some things very sloppily and badly, but the one thing we are good at is surveillance. I mean, anything that happens anywhere in the world with military significance, we're likely to know about it.
Even with the 10-year delays, like Osama bin Laden.
You know, again, I say, if we get on the Twin Towers, for which I had a certain amount of affection. Minoru Yamasaki, the architect who designed the Twin Towers. I don't think they were by any means his most successful creation, but I did admire a lot of his architectural work, and I hated to see those towers go. A few thousand people were killed. That is hardly a magnitude about which most countries get excited. 3,000. And that tells you a lot about terrorists. They can make bold, dramatic strikes, but strikes that are not of continuing significance. They can't occupy territory. They can't keep anything up. It's a bolt out of the blue. Then what happens next? Right? Because they cannot paralyze the country. It cannot even slow a country down. I mean, the recovery from the bold strikes in the United States was nothing. It was not a big economic blow. It was a tragedy for the families of 3,000 people. I mean, let's keep these things in perspective. Now, supposing a terrorist gets, and the government will give them one or sell them one, suppose they somehow get a hold of a nuclear warhead. Well, that's it. They can make one strike, they can do major damage to one major city and an important country in the world. There can be no follow-up. You worry about nuclear strikes by countries because it could be a follow-up. Right? Of course, nuclear strikes by countries don't and won't happen because they deter one another. But it, I suppose, makes a certain amount of sense to worry about that one strike that might be made, but it makes no sense at all to exaggerate.
Professor Douglas,
but just one question about the linkage between terrorism and the notion of deterrence. The strategic posture of the United States throughout the Cold War was based on the notion of deterrence, which was basically that you have the capability to alter the hierarchy of preferences of your adversary by incurring a major cost, a higher cost than the one that he is willing to absorb, he or she is willing to absorb. This is changed by 9/11, in the sense that which is the highest cost that you can incur on the adversary than the taking of his life. Now, if this is true, how that changes our notion of deterrence? How do we perceive deterrence? The Bush administration changed doctrines. I mean, they went to the doctrine of preemptive strikes, preemptive war. Instead of becoming a sitting duck in a lake, I will go out and take the threat and take out the threat before the threat occurs, before the threat manifests itself in my sovereignty. But the problem remains. If these zealots are willing to lose their lives, there is no higher cost that you can incur upon them. So how does that change our notion of deterrence? How can we deter them?
But it's become almost a cliche now. If you don't have an address, deterrence doesn't work. And with terrorists, supposedly, we won't have an address, so we don't know against whom to retaliate. We can take care of that in various ways. You know, one may recall that Cheney, the Secretary, the Vice President of the United States, when the question of striking Iraq, when the question of striking Afghanistan was raised, he said, don't strike Afghanistan, where we thought the terrorists were. They don't have enough good targets. Strike at Iraq. That is, don't strike at the source of what has been done to you, because it's not important. Use the excuse to strike somebody else. Right? I mean, that does change how one thinks about these situations and international policy. If there's a strike against the United States, it would be a good excuse to strike somebody who we wanted to strike anyway. Now, that doesn't mean we won't be struck, but again, terrorists are self-limiting. I mean, you have to limit your worries, and that worry is self-limiting. Terrorists can do one strike. That's it. One shot. Now, you don't want to accept that shot. You don't want to accept the damage that could be done by one shot, but you can. I mean, you lose not a city, you lose a major part of one major city. That city ceases to function as a going political entity, except that buried inside us within a country that will come to its rescue. So there'll be a rapid recovery. Well, I mean, nobody wants it. It's not nice to contemplate, but it's not by any means fatal. It's, let's say, very, very annoying.
He loves making provocative statements, as you can understand. Professor Tamiris.
Professor Waltz, first let me use this opportunity to praise our department based on what you've done. Give us the proverbial pat in the back by saying that throughout the years, a lot of these students have been complaining, why so much microeconomic theory? Why so much economics? And I mean, here's the answer, a living answer of why we try to have a curriculum as broad as possible, and that we should think seriously in our committee tomorrow, maybe something anthropology related. That's the idea. But let me also lodge a complaint of sorts on behalf of this department. Almost all the students here, either graduate or undergraduate, are studying international and European studies. We spend here an awful lot of time studying and thinking about the European Union. Now you just gave us your big scheme of things to come. Nothing, in fact, we haven't even mentioned the European Union so far. So a two-part question here. On the one hand, can you talk a little bit about this strange beast of the European Union? Is it the vindication of democratic peace theory, or is there something else based on neo-realism and structural realism going on? So that's one. And two, since we're in the predictions business, how do you foresee the European Union doing in the next 20, 30 years? Becoming irrelevant, breaking up, getting its act together? What is the prediction?
It's not going to become irrelevant. It already is irrelevant. I say this with some feeling because my lovely Greek daughter-in-law works for the European delegation in Washington. And she has a certain amount of love for the European Union, as she should have, it's appropriate. But the European Union, you know, the first thing you have to know about the European Union is that it's not a union. If it were a union, it could act. It can't act. That is, that any questions that are matters of controversy among the various countries of the European Union, or any matters that are of real political or even economic importance, they can't manage those questions. They can't deal with them. They certainly can't answer them, right? They can't solve problems that are of major political or even economic importance. I thought they might do better on economics than they have done. I guess I was too optimistic. Maybe I'm not realistic enough, right? They can't even manage to handle economic questions, right? And that's, you know, what you would expect. A union that's not a union that's not a political unit, a unit that has no executive, no single executive. I mean, what do we expect it can do? It can handle minor questions, peripheral questions, some economic questions, some social questions, but it can't do big, controversial, political things, and that's obvious. That's already been proved. So,
well, that's a revolutionary statement for here in Greece, because Greece, its security somehow advanced by participating in the European Union.
It's a true statement, yes. But
Professor, you can please.
Yeah, okay. Professor Waltz. Confused because they call it more words here, but yes. I'm projecting my mind in 20 years and reading your thoughts, you know, through your books. I see the United States, Russia, China, India, Brazil, Japan, Germany maybe, Turkey, and to use your words, maybe spread of nuclear weapons. According to your analysis, you have miscalculation of intentional capabilities, is more likely at least. Then we have deterrence, which is more difficult. We have technology which becomes more unpredictable in the sense that it's more difficult to predict the change of power, the shift of power. We have more blurred rules of the game, and of course we have security, more acute security dilemmas. So to reverse my previous argument, make the same argument, do you see any qualitative premises in this multipolar system which make the situation more stable, less unpredictable? Or is it havoc? Is it abuse?
No, it's very, again, it's nuclear weapons. I mean, nuclear weapons have brought us peace. I mean, it's not only that it happens that for 65 years, no major wars, not even significant wars, have occurred. I mean, people it doesn't seem to sink in. I mean, why would that be? I mean, the history has been the history of recurrent wars until August of 1945. I mean, you can date the transformation. We know there was a transformation of the world, say, from the medieval system to the nation-state system. But we can't say when that happened. It was gradual. You can't even say what decade it happened in. But with the nuclear revolution, it happened August 1945 with the dropping of the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And the world of international politics has been turned upside down by that event. As Bernard Brody said, almost immediately after it occurred, and his book came out in 1947, and if you allow some time for him to write it, and the usual time in those days for it to be published, it was almost an instant reaction, as he put it. In the world of conventional weapons, the purpose of weapons was to fight wars. In the world of atomic weapons, the problem of weapons is to prevent wars. And it's been that way ever since. And it is striking the extent to which people, and particularly political officials, and particularly military people, still think in conventional terms. That is, they know about nuclear weapons, but they talk about them and write about them and devise strategies, supposedly, as though they were conventional weapons. Right? We continue to ask, how much is enough? The answer is very simple. You have a second strike force, you've got enough. How much do you need for a second strike force? Well, that's something we can differ about, but I would say that Herbert York, who was neck deep in the nuclear business, by no means a dub, estimated, and he did this in a talk he gave at Lawrence Livermore Nuclear Laboratory. We're talking people who do the nuclear work. 60. He said 60 would be about enough. Right? I've heard Robert McNamara say, 100. You know, I talked to him about it, I asked him about it, make sure that you didn't mean to say 1,000 instead of 100. And, 100 should be enough. Right? You don't need many. So, you got a few nuclear weapons, relatively few. Nobody's going to attack you. You're not going to attack anybody who has nuclear weapons. I mean, they've solved the problem of war. It's gone. It's eliminated. For all the major countries in the world, the only people who can fight wars are poor and weak peripheral countries.
What about, you mentioned before...
Or we can fight wars by beating up poor and weak countries. We seem to love to do it. I mean, Grenada, who would ever have thought of invading Grenada? Why would you want to do that? I mean, the military were kind of slow to respond, and I think, the American military, I think it's because they couldn't figure out where it was. Where is a grenade? But we struggled.
Let me just follow up on Alex's question, if I may. I do agree with you that nuclear deterrence has worked out throughout the Cold War. And you mentioned before that terrorists are self-limited to a first strike, to one strike. And I also agree to that comment, but what about if this is a nuclear strike?
Yeah, that's what I said.
You can lose a major part of a major city. Yes.
But what does that mean? I mean, first of all, it needs a breakdown of deterrence. You cannot deter a terrorist carrying nuclear.
Without an address, you cannot deter.
Right. You cannot deter an aggressor carrying nuclear weapons. A terrorist.
Terrorist,
yeah,
yes.
Right.
Yes.
Through nuclear weapons, we get to another big problem, power. I mean, from sophists to Thucydides to realists, power is central. But what power is? I just read books from Professor Nye that, you know, military power has lost its significance, it's only smart power that is important. How do you think about this analysis? And give us your definition of power, because it's true, I mean, you can occupy a country like Iraq or part of Afghanistan and still do nothing. What's wrong with military power?
Power means you affect other people or other countries more than they affect you. That's how I define it. Doesn't mean you always get your way, doesn't mean you may not get your way at all, but you have more effect on them than they have on you. That means you are a more powerful party.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, moving on from what you have described as the likely evolution of international system, from unipolarity to bipolarity, then to multipolarity, with disappearance of major war. Right? This has been your basic argument so far. Okay, how about the notion of middle powers exploiting bipolarity and multipolarity? Take an example from 18th century, the rise of Prussia. It would have been unthinkable in a bipolar system. Nobody would have let the Prussians do it. But they could do it because Austria was embroiled with France. So, now, in a future world, bipolar, multipolar, where the great powers are cancelling each other out due to nuclear deterrence. How about the possibility of middle powers, and of course, since you are in Greek, you have to say the keyword, Turkey. How about middle powers like that, possibly possessing possibly a nuclear option? How could you enter the prospects in the emerging international system?
How would they exploit the
I don't understand how they wouldn't be able to exploit the international political system.
In the sense that there will be no, they will be left alone basically. They are great powers getting embroiled with each other, and then all these middle powers having enough of a leverage to carve out a known sphere of interest.
It's always been true, of course, that if countries are insignificant and large countries don't pay much attention to them, they often complain about that, the lesser countries, but it's a fact. It's long been a fact that if you're not very important, well, as a woman everybody admired, but they couldn't quite say that she deserved a Nobel Prize in economics. Joan Robinson said the only thing worse than being exploited for a country, the only thing worse than being exploited is not being exploited. It means you don't have anything that anybody else wants. Right?
We consider this round table as a discussion between us six and Professor Waltz, but I see some colleagues from the University of Macedonia, from the University of Peloponnese, from Piraeus. Would you like to take this opportunity to ask a question, Professor Waltz, or Professor Simitis?
Yes.
Please, join us here.
I just wanted to
Why
ask.
you don't join us here, so to make sure that...
First of
of all, I'm a
Professor Simitis is a
political sociologist. So I apologize if my question betrays ignorance of the theory of international relations. I just wanted to ask whether change in the international distribution of power can come from changes within the society of nation-states, and whether the uprising in Arab Muslim societies, which was not predicted, as well as the overthrow of the communist regimes, which was also not predicted, indicate that international theory, the theory of international relations, should give more emphasis on the dynamics of society. That's the first question. And the second question is, I would like to make a counter-statement concerning non-governmental organizations, and to say that losing your life in Palestine is not a way of making income. So thank you.
The second comment is that being involved in non-governmental organization doesn't always have a self-interest financial advantage, but maybe ideological advantage, like losing life in Palestine.
Sure. Well, and the second question, yes, I fully agree. That's true. You know, should international political theory pay more attention to the internal dynamics of states and societies? No, because it's an international political theory. It's not a theory about states or a theory about societies. If one could figure out a way of developing a theory about states and societies, that would be wonderful. But I don't know anybody who's done it. And the fact that nobody's done it indicates that it's at least extremely difficult and maybe not possible at all.
Well, let me use the privilege of the chair to ask the last question that has to do with international politics and morality. Realism has been accused either as amoral, in Thucydides they describe as amoral, or immoral, like Machiavelli. Is it true, these accusations, or there is something to be said about the relation between morality and realism? I mean, just to offer another interpretation. When, for example, Machiavelli said that you can do certain things for the survival of the state, does this imply that another moral value is created, that the reason of the state, the survival of the state, is more important than what the Pope said? So they accuse him as immoral according to the church standard, but maybe extremely moral, the behavior based on the self-interest or self-preservation. So it's not really amoral, it's two different concepts of morality.
Yes, definitely. Can you imagine life without the state, without an organized society? If you start to imagine that, I think you end up with a kind of Hobbesian picture of what life would be like. Anarchy prevailing among people, as it now prevails among states, it's a fearsome thought. I certainly would not want to live in a society, wouldn't be a society. If there's no organization, there is no society. And there would be each person for himself or herself, and devil take the hindmost. I mean, we'd all be competing against one another. Little groups would probably form for the protection of the group. There'd be some groups against other groups. It would be a mess. And there'd be a lot of violence and a lot of danger and a lot of deaths. It's a very, very unpleasant picture. No.
I think that just one word. Okay. The issue of morality was once and for all solved, improved in the 20-year case of Bertard. And I don't know whether international relations, especially, should go around, answering on how the questions. But is it political idealism moral? I would say it's from the beginning moral, because it's internationalist and Sovietist. political realism is more in the sense that it's defending self-survival.
Yeah, I think that realists would generally say the less force that has to be used, the better.
That's prudence, subsidiary. That's exactly right. So realism actually has some guide for action, and at least in Thucydides, the key concepts are sophrosynη and prudence. And with that, we can end this meeting. We would like to thank all of you for being here. I think our discussion provided the students with the opportunity to see somebody that they read his books. And in our class, we love to provoke my students with your statements like more may be better and other things. So you hear the art of provocation. Professor Waltz loves to provoke, and his thoughts make us think deeply about the central issues of world politics. Once again, we are grateful that you have here Professor Waltz, and we would like to thank all of you. Theory with practice. He's also a student of Boson and Waltz.